We have a storm coming. However, this is not a wind and rainstorm. It's a defiant storm. A storm that sends a message over the continent, upends the status quo, and trembles the power structures of Paris, London, and Washington. Africa won't bow down anymore. One man is at the center of this storm. A soldier, a leader, an innovator. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, February of 2024. An occasion that will go down in history. In a daring and unexpected move that shocks the Western world, Traoré drives French troops out of Burkina Faso. Some see him as a hero who is taking back the future of his nation. Others see him as a grave menace to the international order. However, one thing is for sure: he doesn't give up. Regarding the expulsion of French troops, French President Emmanuel Macron stated that he was waiting for answers from Transitional President Ibrahim Traoré. However, the next day, government spokesperson Jean-Emmanuel Ouadrago stated that they are not retreating and that further clarification is not required. The West believed this to be a brief outburst of insurrection that would subside when pressure mounted. Traoré, however, had other ideas. He wasn't simply turning his back on France. The playbook was being rewritten by him. He went to the east. The world held its breath when he did. Russian special forces have just touched down at Burkina Faso. Venezuelan intelligence steps in. Military advisors from Cuba are prepared. France is powerless to stop the change in power dynamics. This is not merely a military change. This serves as a warning to the West. The time of dominance is coming to an end. Captain Traoré too. He has only just begun. However, how did we arrive here? More significantly, what comes next? Let's investigate. The world believed it had already seen this tale. For a little time, an African leader defying the West stood strong before being pulled down by pressure, sanctions, or worse. However, something is different this time. The script is evolving. There are now other players on the board besides the West. Burkina Faso is at the center of the changing power dynamics. There was more to Captain Ibrahim Traoré's expulsion of French forces from Burkina Faso than simply clearing the field of foreign boots. The goal was to break the link that had bound the nation to a system in which France controlled resources, security, and the future. Burkina Faso was supposed to obey for decades. However, all of a sudden, that control vanished, leaving the uncertainty of what would happen next. The expectation was straightforward for the West. Separation. A young, bold leader like Traoré ought to have been left on his own, subject to economic reprisals, military threats, and diplomatic pressure. It always operated that way. If you take away the West, you take away the safety net. If French influence is cut off, the supposed protector becomes a punisher, making sure there are no other options. Traoré, however, wasn't going into the abyss. He was entering a completely different realm. After rejecting France, fresh armies started to arrive within a few weeks. Forces that have no history of invading Africa, stealing its riches, or intending to maintain its subjugation. Cuba, Venezuela, and Russia. They were an indication of a reality that France had refused to accept. Africa's decisions had evolved along with the world. The most notable involvement was that of Russia. Moscow operated under a different set of norms, while the West screamed influence. It was not an occupation when Russian special forces arrived. It was a collaboration. These were not merely soldiers. They were strategists, battlefield professionals, and counterinsurgency experts. They had no intention of dictating. Their purpose was to arm, strengthen, and train. A new empire was not engulfing Burkina Faso. It was becoming ready to stand by itself. Many were surprised by Venezuela's role, but those who were paying closely weren't. Caracas knew what it meant to resist, having been the object of Western sanctions herself. Their intelligence experts were skilled at fending off outside sabotage, creating networks that were not under Western authority, and surviving when everyone was watching and trying to stop them at every turn. Venezuela had the blueprint to end Traoré's isolation if that was what the West chose to do. Then there was Cuba, a nation that has disregarded American pressure for decades, outwitting embargoes, thwarting coups, and forming coalitions in areas the US wanted to see abandoned. In addition to their military knowledge, Cuban advisors contributed their knowledge of self-reliance, resiliency, and surviving in a world that was out to destroy independent countries. This went beyond simply swapping out one armed unit for another for Burkina Faso. There was more to it than that. Authority, real sovereignty, the type that does not rely on former colonial rulers to dictate the definition of security, the kind that increases military power as a means of defending the country, not as a means of furthering foreign interests, the kind that transforms partnerships into leverage rather than shackles. The response from the West was expected: condemnation, fear. France noticed a decline in its power. The United States hinted at stability worries. However, behind the surface, there was something much more disturbing going on. They were setting a precedent. An African country has ejected Western troops without collapsing. It had severed its military links with Europe and avoided anarchy. Rather, it was creating new avenues, putting new connections to the test, and demonstrating that a future free from Western supervision was not only feasible, but already developing right then and there. The change in power was psychological as much as military. An ancient belief was being dismantled: that without Western oversight, Africa could not function independently. That sovereignty, security, and stability were things that should be granted rather than demanded. However, they had already been claimed by Traoré. The new forces in Burkina Faso marked the end of reliance rather than its commencement. The message grew clearer with each new partnership and specialist that arrived. Africa was no longer a Western monopoly. And who would be the next to do it if Burkina Faso could? Why couldn't Mali reject Western rule and survive if Burkina Faso could? How come Niger couldn't? How come the whole Sahel couldn't? African countries' belief in their helplessness was essential to the old world order. That illusion was vanishing now. Officials in Paris rushed to limit the damage. Demands for explanations, frantic calls, and urgent meetings were all present. Mali was already lost by France. The Central African Republic had expelled it. Burkina Faso now? The empire was in decline, and nobody seems to be able to prevent it. Security risks, geopolitical threats, and Russian influence were discussed in whispers by analysts in Washington. However, they realized in their hearts that this was more than just a geopolitical issue. The world was changing, and African countries were no longer requesting permission. This was the moment that the West had been dreading for years, when African nations recognized they had options, when the dependency script was being changed, when the previous colonial overlords no longer held a monopoly on diplomatic and economic influence. So when the West loses control, it does what it always does. Propaganda was used. The machine of media went into overdrive. Numerous reports warned of the region being destabilized by Russian mercenaries. Traoré's affiliations were presented in articles as risky, reckless, and a security risk. Rumors circulated about coups, instability, and the impending anarchy in Burkina Faso. However, the Western strategy was outdated, cliched, and worse, ineffectual. Because a fundamental shift had occurred. Not all of Traoré's resistance was to Western influence. He was winning. It was visible to everyone. Burkina Faso citizens sensed it. And leaders watched from all throughout Africa. The narrative had been dominated by the West for years. The notion that African countries lacked sufficient strength. It was said so frequently that some Africans even came to feel that they were too divided and unskilled to run themselves. However, Traoré had destroyed that delusion. We operate in a variety of methods, but the most popular one is probably finding a third-world nation with resources that our firms want, like oil, and then securing a sizable loan from the World Bank or one of its sister organizations. But the nation never receives the money. Instead, money is used by our own firms to construct power plants, highways, industrial parks, and other infrastructure projects that benefit a select few wealthy individuals in that nation and our own corporations, but not the vast majority of the populace. However, they, the entire nation, are left with a massive debt that is unaffordable. The economic hitmen then go back and say, "Give us a pound of flesh, because you owe us a lot of money and are unable to pay back your debts." When I was unable to persuade them to take these debts and to enslave their countries, I realized that the jackals were immediately behind me. And these are the folks who terminate their leaders or topple regimes. And since I was unable to corrupt them, CIA-sponsored jackals terminated both Ecuador's Jane Roldos and Panama's Omar Torrijos. Without France, Burkina Faso was not going to collapse. It was expanding. And what did the West have left if it no longer actually controlled Burkina Faso? Military bases were no longer the exclusive source of the worry. The loss of an empire was at issue. Can Burkina Faso survive without the West, however, is the current question. Is Russian assistance sufficient? Soldiers are not the only source of power. It has to do with money. And if military outposts weren't enough to keep Burkina Faso under control, the West now possessed economic strangulation as a weapon. France's hegemony over West Africa for many years extended beyond its military presence. It concerned a financial structure intended to maintain the reliance of its former colonies. The currency that Paris controls is the CFA franc. Trade routes that return to Europe every time. Foreign assistance that appeared to be kind, but actually served as a leash that tightened any time a leader crossed the line. Burkina Faso had just made a daring move by severing the military connections that allowed France to maintain its dominance. However, would it be able to endure without the financial security that the West had built around it? The answer, according to Western strategists, was no. This was nothing new to them. The economies of leaders who opposed France were pinched. The investment was taken out. Trade was stopped. Aid was frozen. It was a well-known script. The financial retaliation followed the military expulsion. Then the collapse, which was inevitable. The system operated that way. However, something different occurred this time. Burkina Faso remained intact. It turned around. It resorted to new finance partners, new trade lines, and new economic survival strategies. Traoré has been getting ready for this. Additionally, he had already discovered a fresh power source when the West attempted to cut the connection. Russia intervened by investing. Yes, with investments as well as the military. Venezuela introduced energy alliances. Constantly observing, China recognized a chance. Additionally, it circumvented Western control by opening the door to alternative banking systems, trade agreements, and infrastructure finance with a single action. It was an obvious message. Burkina Faso was able to prosper without the approval of the West. However, leaving an economic empire involves more than simply switching partners. It has to do with altering the game's rules. And Traoré's goal was precisely that. He began by attacking the CFA franc, which is the center of Western control. Burkina Faso and a large portion of West Africa had been economically oppressed for years by this colonial-era currency. France clung to the financial chains as soon as its military power was diminished. Traoré, however, was already seeing past it. Silently, plans were underway to transition to a new monetary system that was not dependent on Paris. France was aware that Burkina Faso's CFA franc would be the last departure from French rule. Second, Traoré realized that power came from food. He shifted his focus to agricultural self-sufficiency because Burkina Faso was vulnerable due to its reliance on Western aid. Rice production saw a sharp increase in investment. Local industries were being revitalized after being neglected for a long time due to trade rules dictated by other countries. Burkina Faso would no longer rely on food begging. It was destined to yield it. Third, the goal of energy independence was established. Burkina Faso depended on energy imports supported by France for much too long. However, Venezuela, one of the biggest oil-rich countries in the world, provided an alternative. Fuel agreements that didn't need Western consent. Supply of energy that were not easily turned off. Paris's response came instantly. There were rumors of sanctions. Economic consequences became more and more of a threat. Deeply ingrained in the Burkina Faso economy, French firms started to retreat. However, they were surprised at the extent of the destruction. The nation did not fall apart. It changed. The West was frightened by this. Burkina Faso was demonstrating something hazardous, not merely severing relations. It demonstrated that a country might exist without adopting Western financial systems, that a nation may establish a fresh foundation and resist economic blackmail. Burkina Faso was attempting to become a player in the global economy rather than merely a pawn for the first time in modern history. The rest of Africa was also observing. But there is a pattern throughout history. One result keeps happening whenever an African leader tries to oppose Western rule, pushes too far, breaks too many connections, and refuses to bow. A coup. Thomas Sankara experienced it in 1987. Patrice Lumumba experienced it in 1961. Muammar Gaddafi experienced it in 2011. The formula was always the same: isolate, destabilize, and topple. Burkina Faso is now the center of attention. Captain Ibrahim Traoré has been defying the odds for months. French forces have been expelled by him. He has established military ties with non-Western nations. The economic ties that held Burkina Faso behind have been severed by him. Most perilously, he has revealed the system, demonstrating to other African countries that independence is a viable option rather than merely a pipe dream. However, the risk increases with every step taken, because loss is not something the West just accepts. There is just one last tactic after the failure of intelligence operations, media campaigns, and sanctions: change of regime. Traoré is aware of it. Division is the first step. Foreign invaders are not the ones that lead the most successful coups. Insiders, government officials, military officers, and even trusted allies who have been corrupted carry them out. Direct attacks are not necessary on the part of the West. All it has to do is locate the appropriate individuals, present the right offers, and allow the betrayal to happen within. Chaos is the second step. Western weapons inexplicably finding their way into the hands of insurgents has neatly contributed to the insurgency situation that Burkina Faso is currently experiencing. Calls for a change in leadership will become urgent if the nation is forced into even greater turmoil, and if the security situation worsens. The story changes. Once portrayed as the man bringing order back, Traoré is now portrayed as a failure. They offer a remedy, which coincidentally entails taking him out of office. The last blow is the last one. An abrupt and violent change of power, a well-planned military coup. A new leader is announced in a matter of hours. A leader who makes stability pledges. A head of state who promises to bring back international collaboration. A leader whose first action is to extend an invitation to the recently ousted Western military to return. Africa has been experiencing this pattern for many years. The West is currently anticipating if Burkina Faso will be the next to collapse. However, keep in mind that Traoré is not naive despite his youth. He is aware of the trend. He has researched the past. He isn't waiting to be the next statistic either. Securing complete allegiance within his soldiers has been his first action. Traoré has carefully reorganized important military positions, assigning only the most dependable officers to crucial roles, in contrast to past presidents who presumed their inner circle was secure. He eliminated those who were thought to have outside influence. Instead of depending on officials with Western training who could be turned at any time, he has established a network of direct leadership. Second, he has assumed command of the security forces in Burkina Faso. Secrecy and working inside foreign regimes undetected are what Western intelligence services thrive on. However, Traoré has stated unequivocally that no shadow actors will be operating the nation in secret. The activities of intelligence have been consolidated. There is now more surveillance on possible traitors. Politicians having too much Western links, the typical suspects in coups, and foreign-trained military officers are being constantly monitored. Above all, Traoré is mobilizing the populace. Without popular backing, no coup can succeed, and this is where he has an advantage. Traoré has become a symbol of the people's struggle for sovereignty, in contrast to previous dictators who were ousted quietly and with no opposition. It won't be a smooth transition if an attempt is made to remove him. It will lead to a revolution across the country. Furthermore, a coup that escalates into a civil war is much riskier than the West would prefer. Burkina Faso is thus at a turning point. Whether Traoré is successful in changing the course of the nation, or if he slips into the same trap that has befallen so many others before him, will be determined in the coming months. However, one thing is evident. Burkina Faso is no longer the only issue here. This is about the awakening of a continent. African countries, including Guinea, Niger, and Mali, are keeping an eye on it. The rest of Africa will have its proof if Traoré can terminate the cycle and live without falling into the coup trap. Being independent is more than a pipe dream. This reality is only ready to be seized. And that is the biggest danger facing the West. The fight is far from done. It's just getting started. This shows us, for example, what happens when you break with the West and form new partnerships with nations like Russia. However, Traoré is prepared to deal with any aggression from the West. Is it possible for West to force Traoré to bow? Does Burkina Faso need anyone now that has new alliances? Why does the West still believe it can rule over African countries? Tell us what you think in the comments section below.